I want to talk to you guys about some good news, or at least good news from the diplomatic position of the Ukrainians. If it is viewed as them fulfilling their promises, which in my mind, it 100% is. Ukraine has signed the mineral deal with the United States. The long talked about, the long negotiated, the long gone through minerals deal that Donald Trump wanted in order to show that the United States is getting something out of this relationship in reciprocation for its diplomatic and military support for Ukraine. Now, originally, the way this deal was thrown out, there was a bad version and then there was a worse version. Originally, the Ukrainians came out and said, look, how about we trade mineral rights and exports for new aid packages? That was the way that they threw it out there. It was like, this is how we can find a way to continue aid while delivering on Trump's promise to make sure that that America gets paid. Then the Trump administration saw this, it's like, oh, this is great. How about we do this to cover the $350 billion worth of debt you guys accrued through our aid packages? Number one, aid is not debt. If it was debt, it'd be things like a weapons sale or would have stipulated that. And two, it was not 350 billion. The real number, if you wanted to check with institutes that or like groups that were more respectable in tracking aid, would be about 130 billion. And hell, even when we're talking about that money, are we going to include things like the aid that went to expanding American artillery production that we're not even currently sending to Ukraine? Like what? Like all the artillery shells that we're going to make and not send if we don't continue to send aid packages? Is that aid to Ukraine or is that aid to the American defense industry? Should that be calculated? Either way, this was a complete shift from what the Ukrainians wanted. So the dynamic of the mineral deal was completely shifted from this is how we can continue to get aid to this is how we can pay off a debt that we didn't even know we accrued. And it only got worse. From there, we went from that to this new agreement that was proposed by the Trump administration. And they were saying verbally in public at the time, no negotiation. We cannot negotiate this. Sign it now. That was Trump's official position. No negotiation. No more talking. Sign the deal now. You have to sign it now and bring it into law. Both skipping the fact that you can't force a deal that quickly down somebody's throat, especially when it has to do with their natural resources, rights, and one of the few pathways they might have to help rebuild their country. And the fact that it has to go through their parliament because Ukraine, despite what many people say, is a parliamentarian democracy. Flawed, but a parliamentarian democracy. And the Rada, their parliament, has a say in when these types of agreements are signed. And now that it has been signed, it actually hasn't been ratified by the Ukrainians. It has to go before the Rada. And I think the earliest that can happen is on the 13th. It might be between the 13th or 15th. So this new agreement that the Americans were pushing before they eventually got pushed back and we got what we got today was asking for primary decision making over Ukrainian like investments and where this money would be going. They would be getting the majority of the seats on this investment board fund, so they would be the ones making most of the decisions. They would get export priority and a lot of priority in a way, prioritizing other states that would deny Ukraine the ability to join the European Union, which, if you know anything about this war, is a really, really big deal. It's a really big deal for the future of Ukrainian security. It's a really big deal for the future of European security. It's a really big deal as for why this war was even fought in the first place, why Euromaidan happened. Euro is a big part of that. And a big part that I think scared me probably more than anything was and that's not true, but I think it's definitely one of the scariest. I think the thing that scared me more than anything was the EU part. But the second scariest was that they got no control over ports and infrastructure. That would be going over to the United States. The United States would have primary control over Ukrainian ports. The United States would have primary control of Ukrainian bridges, Ukrainian railroads, Ukrainian infrastructure. So it went from a debt that, aid that we said we were giving them out of our national interest to, hey, here's a proposal on how we can continue to get aid while paying you guys back, to here's a $350 billion check that you never signed for. Also, no EU. Also, we're the primary decision maker. Also, we own all your ports, bridges, this and that. Also, we're going to be the ones primarily benefiting from X resource extraction as a primary beneficiary, making profit, meaning that money's not going to be re-injected into rebuilding efforts. The deal was terrible, to put it bluntly. The deal was so bad that there was zero chance, zero, and I'll stand by this, that it was ever going to get through the Rada. Even if they somehow convinced Zelensky to sign it, which they did not, it was never going to get through the Ukrainian Rada because MPs just would not stand for it because it was such a bad deal. And so even though the Trump administration did everything they could to pressure the Ukrainians to sign it, they did not sign it without renegotiation. And so this went on and went on and went on. And let me tell you, that negotiating got ugly. Zelensky got described as a dictator during this process. A dictator. Oh, we need to... Ukraine's not immediately seceding to our crazy mineral demands. Well, that must be because Zelensky's a dictator. Zelensky's a dictator. And then it was not just the Zelensky's a dictator part. It was all sorts of bashing of Ukraine, bashing of Zelensky, and public pressure to try to get them to cave on this and just give Trump everything he wanted. But the Ukrainians largely kept their nose stiff. They trudged forward. They showed resilience. And what I said when Zelensky was first having to figure out how to deal with second-term Trump, what I said was they should prioritize bloodying his nose in a situation like this. And I know that's, might feel uncomfortable, might feel counterproductive, but you cannot, and that doesn't mean going out there and assaulting the president, but you make it clear if he makes some crazy demand, it's like, sir, we're not going to do that. You just can't do that. It's just not going to happen. Malcolm Turnbull and other foreign leaders that have dealt with Trump have talked about the effectiveness of making clear where your national interests lie, never backing off of them. And I think that if you do that, it's going to make an impression. The Russians are trying that, and it has made an impression. They're restating their position. It's an old Molotov tactic. And now they've signed the deal. And what does this deal have in it, you guys might be curious? Well, let me tell you what it does not have in it. Number one, no debt. Meaning that we went from $350 billion worth of debt that was going to be placed on the heads of the Ukrainians, and that's Trump's made-up number, to zero. Zero debt. There's going to be zero debt, and the money that is taken from this is not calculated or in any way in reference to, some amount of debt that is being placed upon Ukraine, a formal debt amount. So that's a positive for the Ukrainians. The biggest positive, though, of course, is EU membership is still open. And the way that the deal has been written is that if the deal in any way contradicts with EU membership, it can be altered, which I am very curious when this war is over, how exactly that is going to be used during the EU membership process. And if the Ukrainians are going to try to bend it in certain ways to make this is now compliant with EU, but let's push a little bit more. I'm curious on how they're going to use that to wiggle. Also, another thing, America is no longer the primary decision maker. It's not an American-dominated board anymore over this investment fund. And also, the United States has no control over Ukrainian ports, over Ukrainian infrastructure, over Ukrainian railways, or Ukrainian bridges. All of the worst parts of this deal were taken out. All of the worst parts. That's not to say all of the bad parts were taken out. The United States is still going to be profiting off of this and taking money out of how many Ukrainian MPs have complained about, money that could be redirected to rebuilding the country. There's no security deal on this whatsoever. This was something that was talked about by the Ukrainians, that they wanted a long-term security arrangement based off of this, and there's nothing on that. And of course, there's also the problem that I really don't see how you're going to get, even if you have this investment fund, even if you're talking about investing this, investing that, how are you going to get businesses to invest in Ukraine on a large scale? And there are some businesses already taking the leap, already taking the risk. How are you going to do that if you don't put things in place to take care of risk assurance? If you are wanting to invest in Ukraine, but the Russians are bombing stuff, you're going to be worried that your investment's going to blow up and then you're going to be out of all your money. And so you need to have some way to provide risk assurance. One way was security arrangements where businessmen would know, oh, we're protected by the umbrella of NATO, so I'm okay to invest in a, some Zapka's coming to Ukraine, or we're bringing like some frozen yogurt stand, whatever. Doesn't matter. But there's no risk assurance. There's no way to assure for that. There's no way to control for that, either when it comes to a certain amount of money put aside to say if companies lose X, Y, and Z, we'll step in, and there's no security arrangement. And so I think that it's one thing to say, hey, we have an investment fund. It's another thing to actually attract private business and change the landscape as part of the investment fund. Here's another aspect that's a little weird. Future aid to Ukraine, that means if the United States was to pass a $20 billion aid package, and it would include things like artillery shells or air defense systems, that would count as a contribution to the fund. Now, to be clear, it's an investment fund for Ukraine's rebuilding and, its economy. So making it so that aid packages equal investment in Ukraine's economy. Look, I'm sorry. There is extreme need in Ukraine for air defense systems. There's a reason why the Ukrainians said, we want to give you $15 billion for 10 Patriots. We want to do this. Please do this, Trump. And Trump just kind of like hand waved the idea away. But the reason they wanted that, the reason they talked about it, is because they need air defense systems to protect their cities. They need artillery shells to stop the Russian advances. They need these aid packages, but this is not an investment in their economy. If you take a tank and you drive it to the front line and it blows up, you could say at the time of producing the tank that, hey, that contributed 600,000 or 700,000 to, our productive capacity because of how much the tank was worth. But if it blew up, you didn't add to your economy. You could call it a GDP increase if you want to, but everything you invest into blowing up is not a long-term economic plan make. So the fact that they're counting aid as an investment, I feel a little weird about. I understand that the Ukrainians are trying to find ways to incentivize aid, but I'm talking about this as a mechanism for the future Ukrainian economy, not just as a mechanism to fight against the Russians. To be clear, the technical aspects of this haven't really been hammered out too hard. So there might be some more details that come down the tube in the future. Most of this has been pretty political. It has been just kind of the fighting over the broad strokes instead of like implementation. So I'm very interested to see who Trump puts in place to actually try to implement this, and whether he chooses people of competence and skill, or if he chooses Kash Patel types, or if he chooses Steve Witkoff types, or if he chooses Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth, and RFK types, or honestly, it's pretty difficult to think of a name of, I guess somehow Marco Rubio is the name that comes to mind when it comes to most competent, which is kind of scary. Also, there's another problem with this. I'm sorry, I keep listing the problems, but they keep coming to me in waves. Due to the American influence on the board, there's also going to be, and this has been complained about by MPs, a certain amount of control that limits Ukraine's ability to choose partners when it comes to investment in rebuilding. So there could be a more economical option to rebuild something, and the American board members decide, no, we want to give it to this company that I think is going to come and benefit us more, even though the investment fund for rebuilding would probably benefit more, and specifically Ukraine would benefit more if we paid less for this company, or if we, spent money on the company that would provide local jobs to the war-torn economy. Now, I know I've listed off a few problems, and I think they're legitimate, but let's be clear, Ukraine has negotiated a masterstroke here, in my opinion. Ukraine went from a deal that would stop them from going into the European Union, that saddled them with a bunch of debt, all of it unjustified, that would allow America to be the primary decision maker over Ukrainian mineral export, that would take away control from the ports, bridges, railroads, and their infrastructure, and made it workable, and killed all of that. So in the grand scheme of things, I think this is a much better deal than what we could have gotten, and probably one of the better deals the Ukrainian negotiators could have negotiated, all things considered. But let's just throw this out there. Trump did everything he could to indicate that they had to sign a deal right now. Sign it right away, sign it right away, sign it right away. All of this public pressure, but Ukraine stood strong and got a deal that is actually feasible, which, given the unfeasible nature of the world right now, is pretty good. Is pretty good. Now, what do we do after this? Well, of course, we still need to wait for the RADA to actually certify it. Again, that's the 13th and the 15th. But once that happens in 11 or 12 days, or even really before that happens, because it seems the Trump administration is really more working down from a top-down approach. Now what? Ukraine has given the Trump administration basically most, if not almost, everything they wanted. As Trump has taken NATO membership off the table, as Trump has kept the Ukrainians from the negotiating room and got us no closer to peace. And for anybody who's telling me that, oh, we had to do that for peace, the Russians just said that they might be willing to do direct negotiations with the Ukrainians after Victory Day. So apparently that wasn't the case. Apparently we could have insisted, and we just decided to be so weak that something the Russians were willing to just give us, we could not even take. We could not even take what the Russians were willing to give us. The Ukrainians agreed to the unconditional, immediate 30-day ceasefire. The Russians didn't. Zelensky has done his best to be as polite, at least towards Trump himself individually, since the Oval Office disaster, fiasco. The Ukrainians have taken a lot of the bashing, both from the conservative media sphere and from the White House, being described as a barnyard animal that needed to be beaten into submission, in stride. They've dealt with all of this. They've been on the receiving end of some really brutal war crimes. What more could Ukraine do for Trump? Ukraine's saying, we want to pay for the air defense systems. We want to give you that W you can bring home and say, we're being paid fair now. I said we'd get paid, and we are getting paid. I said we get our fair share, that America wouldn't be taken advantage of. That's happening. He's trying to give them that. He agreed to all of his ceasefires. He agreed. The Russians didn't. He signed the mineral deal. I'm saying about Ukraine as a male. I guess, you know what? Ukraine's male. We've decided that's Ukraine's male on the channel now. But Ukraine has, and Zelensky has done most of what Trump has wanted. In my mind, what more could they do now to get another aid package? What more could they do now to get large-scale weapon sales approved? Not $50 million. Not something that in the grand scheme of things is going to mean next to nothing. What more could Ukraine do? So at this point, if the Russians continue to play games, and right now they're continuing to drag it out, they don't want an immediate ceasefire. They want to wait for Victory Day so they can have the big charade and then immediately start the war again after. At some point, you have to say, look, Ukraine agreed to the unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine agreed to our mineral deal. Ukraine agreed to the things that we wanted, notwithstanding recognition of Crimea, which was an insane demand that was never going to get accepted. Recognition of Crimea for nothing in return. My God, rewriting the world order for not even peanuts, negative peanuts. There has to be a recognition that Ukraine has played ball with the United States while the Russians have continued to humiliate Trump. Republican Senator Kennedy has acknowledged it, that they're taking Trump for like a fool, and they're disrespecting Trump. That's the exact words they use, that they're disrespecting Trump, that Putin is disrespecting Trump. They've agreed to ceasefires in private, and then when they go in public, they announce completely separate terms, and the terms that they do agree to, they still don't adhere to. They didn't adhere to the ceasefire that they did declare. They didn't adhere to the civilian ceasefire. They didn't adhere to the energy ceasefire. So at what point do you say, obviously the situation has to change before the Russians are willing to see reason? Because if the deal becomes, no, we're walking away, we're not going to send any more aid to Ukraine, we're not going to send any more help to Ukraine, even as the Russians continue to push on, we're just going to walk away from this, then Ukraine will rip up the mineral deal. They have no reason to engage with the mineral deal. If the United States decides to walk away, quote unquote, not from the fact that the Russians and the Ukrainians right now negotiating a peace settlement is going to be pretty difficult, but walking away from the war entirely and just kind of wiping your hands of it after you said you were the magic art of the deal man. If they do that, the Ukrainians have no reason to stay in the mineral deal. They have zero reason to stay in the mineral deal. If you want the Ukrainians to adhere by the agreements that they made with us, then we need to adhere by the agreements that we made with them. And that means sticking with them through this thick and thin.